So now the issue that I am trying to deal with in this upcoming book, which has been provisionally titled something along the lines of rescuing reason from tradition, reviving the culture of intellectual inquiry in Islam, with that would be the subtitle, the second part. The issue I am trying to grapple with in this particular text is how did it happen in the first place that rational inquiry acquired such a poor reputation among Muslims. I think we can see this poor reputation in the attitude of quite a number of Muslim commentators to the so-called rationalists, otherwise known as the Mu'tazilites, who are typically considered to be outside of the fold of Islam, allegedly because they placed reason above revelation. Now, when we take a closer look at what is taking place after the rule of the rationalists, we find that something has changed, but some things appear to have remained the same. Because when you look at the traditionalist articulation or interpretation of Islam, you find that certainly they do not place reason above revelation. However, they appear to be placing something else also above revelation, and this should be just as concerning to us as the people who allegedly placed reason above revelation. Now, what is it that the traditional commentators appear to be placing above revelation? Well, it is nothing other than tradition. It appears that tradition has been placed in some very important ways above revelation in what we normally understand to be traditional Islam. Now, how did this happen, and what form does this take place? I think among the clearest expressions of the reversal of the relationship between revelation and tradition is found in two common sayings by Muslim commentators. The first of which is that, I quote, tradition judges the book or the Quran, end of quote. In Arabic, the expression goes like this, I quote, as-sunnah qadiya al-Quran, end of quote, which literally translated means that the sunnah judges the Quran, end of quote. Now, how can anything judge the Quran when the Quran itself was sent down as a criterion for judging between right and wrong? This is a question that needs to be answered. Now, the second way in which tradition has been elevated above revelation is expressed in a saying that the Quran or revelation requires tradition more than tradition requires revelation. End of quote. Now, this is once again a very surprising statement, because it seems to subordinate revelation to tradition. Now, we need to remember that tradition is something that has developed out of revelation. Revelation did not develop out of tradition. We need to be careful not to confuse revelation with tradition. Yet, this is what appears to have taken place, at least to some extent. Now, how did this happen? I think among the reasons for this development, and by the way, this development has been noticed by a few scholars. I might mention Taha Jabir Alwani, especially his latest book, published in 2017, called Reviving the Balance, and I recommend viewers have a look at it. The book is available in PDF format on the internet. In that book, Alwani addresses, among many issues, these particular issues as well. So what he's actually trying to do in the book is to restore the original relationship between revelation and tradition, which appears to have been distorted to some extent by reversing the relationship between tradition and revelation to the point where tradition ends up judging revelation, and tradition becomes indispensable to revelation rather than vice versa. So now, to come back to the question, how did this develop? Among the various possibilities I explored in my own reading, The one that appears to be most comprehensive or most convincing to me at this point in time goes back to a tradition in which the Prophet, peace be on him, was allegedly reported to have said that the use of reason in understanding revelation is a form of disbelief or kufr. End of quote. Now, to say that using your reason or akal in Arabic to understand revelation is a form of kufr or disbelief, to me is another very surprising statement. Because how do we know anything if we are not using our reason to gain knowledge? To say that the use of reason to understand revelation is a form of disbelief is actually to discourage people from using their reason to understand revelation, and thereby it is to discourage them or make it harder for them to understand and know revelation. So to me, this was a very surprising, tradition, and I think it needs to be looked into. We have to remember that the Quran, on multiple occasions, exhorts people to use their reason. The Quran is not against reason. The Arabic expression "afala taqilun" occurs very frequently in the Quran, and it means, will you not use your reason? So now coming back to the question of how did tradition end up being in a position above revelation, I think what appears to have transpired is that when the people were informed that the use of their reason to understand revelation is a form of disbelief, of course not many people wanted to use their reason to understand the revelation, because that would make them, according to this tradition, into disbelievers. So since they wanted to be believers, they began to refrain from using their reason to understand the revelation. All right, but what was the effect of this reluctance to use their reason? The effect was very simple. It was reduced knowledge and understanding of revelation due to the fact that people began to use their reason less and less, and in fact, to some extent, some of them perhaps abstained from it altogether. Now, the bias or prejudice against reason is particularly strong in a Sufi tradition, which kind of disdains the use of reason as a way of gaining knowledge, and instead recommends mystical experience as the proper way to attain knowledge. Now, to be fair to both sides, we need to recognize that the Quran itself speaks of the heart, a qalb, as the faculty of perception or understanding. The Quran speaks, for instance, of people who have hearts with which they do not understand. So aql or reason is not a sufficient condition for understanding or attaining knowledge of revelation. We could say perhaps that reason or aql is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for understanding revelation. Something more is required to understand revelation fully, and that something more perhaps could be referred to as intuition or insight. I believe the Arabic word is ma'rifa, which is a higher kind of knowledge, admittedly, but even that kind of knowledge, I believe, does not dispense with the use of the intellect in the pursuit of an acquisition of knowledge. So now, to come back to the question, how did tradition end up, as it were, in a position above revelation? Once the people decided that it was wrong to use reason to understand revelation, they began to encounter what appeared to them as ambiguous verses in the Quran. Now, these verses appeared ambiguous to them, I reiterate, because they were reluctant to use their reason to its full capacity. Now, as they encountered some verses, or as some verses struck them as ambiguous or unclear, they basically declared that the Quran itself contains unclear verses and ambiguous verses, and they designated these verses by the term mutashabihat. This term occurs in verse 7, surah number 3, which differentiates two types of verses in the Quran: the basic and fundamental verses, which are called ayat muhkamat, and the other kind of verses which the Quran calls ayat mutashabihat. But the catch is this: when you look in the dictionary, the word mutashabihat in Arabic does not mean unclear or ambiguous. It means allegorical. So it is wrong to identify the ayat mutashabihat as ambiguous or unclear verses. It is the second problem with the perception that the Quran contains unclear or ambiguous verses is that this perception doubts or questions the perfection of the Quran and seems to imply that there's a defect or a flaw in the Quran, the defect or flaw being the ambiguity of some of the verses. All right, now to proceed to come back to the next question. What happened next? Well, after you encounter verses in the Quran which appear ambiguous to you, obviously you try to clarify them and to understand them. And this took place, and how did this clarification take place? Well, here comes tradition to the rescue. Supporters of tradition argued that we can clarify these ambiguous verses by reference to tradition. In other words, tradition rather than reason was going to help us to understand the Quran. Now, this is another surprising claim, because when you look at tradition or the traditions, the collections of the books of traditions, we find that in fact there are many ambiguities within those books of traditions which themselves require a great deal of explanation and clarification. So how is a book that itself requires a great deal of explanation and clarification going to explain a book, another book, especially a book that is presented to us as the book from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who would not be expected to be ambiguous in his expression? How are we going to help explain the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by referring to human reports which themselves are full of contradictions and inconsistencies? So this is another problem with the interpretation of the Quran in light of tradition, which appears to be part of the mainstream traditional approach to the interpretation of the Quran. So now the whole thing doesn't stop there. There are more points to consider. After turning to tradition to explain revelation, the interpreters had to take a very important step in order to be able to engage tradition to explain revelation. And this very important step was to designate tradition itself as another form of revelation, wahi, in addition to the Quran. So the exegetes differentiated two kinds of revelation. One they called the apparent or obvious or manifest revelation, which was the Quran, and the other one was the hidden or internal revelation, which they called wahi batin. Now, the very expression, the very term wahi batin or concealed revelation appears to be a kind of oxymoron, because it says that here we have a revelation which is concealed, while the word revelation means something that is made obvious or manifest. Now, I don't have time to go into that particular note. We can do so perhaps at another time. But what has happened as a result of the identification of tradition as revelation is that suddenly tradition attained a status of equality with revelation. The books of tradition suddenly became equal to the Quran in terms of authority. Now, this is another amazing development, because we know very well from our reading of the Quran that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has no equals, and therefore we may well ask, if Allah has no equals, how can there be any other text equal in authority to the Quran, which is the word of Allah? In other words, the designation of tradition as revelation presents a problem for the teaching of Tawheed. Now, how do we reconcile? How do we, untie or resolve this dilemma? What to do? Once again, the development did not stop there. There were still some verses that, even after engaging tradition, there were still some verses that struck exegetes as unclear, not only unclear, but even contradictory. Now, tradition was not able to, explain these contradictions, so the exegetes reached out to another method of resolving what seemed to them as contradictions in the Quran, and that methodology was the doctrine of abrogation. So basically they said that, all right, the verses in the Quran which appear contradictory to us, Those verses which were revealed earlier, we will consider as abrogated by the verses that were revealed later.